Good morning. So last week we went through some of the primary sources regarding the mitzvah of Teichacha, the mitzvah of Teichech Samisecha, which we discussed means actually two things, but what the meaning that we're focusing on is the mitzvah to rebuke somebody who is doing an avera. And we saw the Rambam and Sefer Chinuch. Let's review a couple of quick things over here. The Gemara in Erechin Daf Tazayin Amud Beis talks about, says, how do you know that if you see somebody doing something wrong, you have to rebuke him? Shenemar Hecheach Techeach refers to this pasuk. Then the Gemara says, how do you know that if Hechiach V'loi Kibloi, Hechiach V'loi Kibel, that if you rebuked him and he did not listen to you, so you told him that you're not allowed to drive on Shabbos, and yet he's continuing to drive on Shabbos? How do you know that you have to continue to rebuke him? So the Gemara deduces from the double expression of the Torah, Hocheach Tocheach, rebuke, you shall rebuke. So the double expression teaches us that afilu mea pa'amim, that you have to, you have to continue, and elsewhere the Gemara uses the expression afilu mea pa'amim, you have to continue rebuking him until he accepts the rebuke. So you may, what about even, do you have to do it even if you're going to embarrass him? So the end of the pasuk tells us, do not carry him, or do not, depends on different, we discussed last week, different interpretations, but the Gemara over here is saying, don't do it in a way that will be sinful, don't embarrass him in the process. And then we saw Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah both say, I would be astonished if there was anybody in this generation who knows how to give or to receive rebuke, because, and he uses the expression, why do you tell me to take away the splinter from between my eyes? You take away the beam from between your eyes. So already in the generation of the Tanoim, we find already a caution as to how to do this mitzvah, whether or not there's anybody who actually knows how to do it properly. And then later on in the Gemara, we have this three-pronged machlokes as to what extent, till when is the chiyuv of Teichacha. Rav said, Hakah, you have to be mechiach him, you have to rebuke him until he hits you, until he strikes you. And we saw that the Rambam changes that and says not until he actually strikes you, but until he's about to strike you. Shmuel says until he curses you, and Rabbi says until he reprimands you. Now, so we know that you have to be mechiach him time and again, up to 100 times and more, until he hits you, until he curses you, until he reprimands you. And there seems to be two ways of understanding what this is all about. One way of understanding it is that the mitzvah of Teichacha, and remember the Gemara says we have Hocheach, the one word, and then there's a double expression which teaches you that even if he did not listen to you, so you rebuked him, you fulfilled the first word Hocheach, you rebuked him, he did not accept the rebuke. How do you know that you have to continue rebuking him? Tochiach, right? Go at it again. So how are we to understand that extra word Tochiach? One way of understanding it seems to be that even if you know he's not going to listen to you, these are all already in the Rishonim, we have different opinions over here. Even if you know he's not going to listen to you, you still have to rebuke him again and again. Because even though you're not going to change his behavior, part of your responsibility as Kol Yisrael Arevim is to denounce anybody who's behaving inappropriately, because you have to demonstrate that you are not part of this rebellion against God. And so, so long as he's not hitting you or cursing you or reprimanding you according to different opinions, you have to continue demonstrating that you do not want to be part of this rebellion against God. And that's why you're continuing to rebuke him, not because you want to necessarily change his ways. You know it's too late, you can't change his ways. Another way of understanding it seems to be that that when we say Hecheach Techeach, what that means is that you have to continue rebuking him again and again not because you have to do so even though you're not going to change him, but because because the Torah is telling you that you never really know 100%. Maybe even though he didn't listen to you, maybe if you continue doing it again, not in an embarrassing way, but in a meaningful way, maybe you will be successful. And that is true until the point where he's about to hit you, or about to strike you, about to he's cursing you, whatever it is. Then you know, okay, now that's it, it's all done. And the two sources that the primary sources that we saw last week, seem to indicate according to this second way. I'm not going to find the text right now, but we saw these texts last week, and we saw the way the Rambam defined the mitzvah was that the mitzvah is lachziro lemutov, to change him, to bring him to the right path. And then he said that you have to continue doing so until he's about to hit you. And similar in the Sefer HaChinuch. So it appears from their formulation that the mitzvah is to change, to influence the person to change his ways, to stop driving in Shabbos, and the mitzvah to do so, and so long as he isn't actually about to strike you or about cursing you, etc., according to different opinions, then there is, I guess, some iota of a chance that you might be effective. Now, how do we paskin about this? So I'm going to show you, and this we'll do on the screen over here, two halachas in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, which will then, after we read them, we will compare them. So number one, this comes up in the laws of Yom Kippur. Where there the discussion is about people who don't realize that the mitzvah is to actually accept Yom Kippur a few minutes before sunset. So he says like this. Following principle applies in a situation in which women eat and drink until the actual beginning of Bein Hashmashos, that's at sunset, unaware that it is a mitzvah to add time from the mundane realm into the realm of holiness. So you have to take some time of Erev Yom Kippur and add that to Yom Kippur. If one is certain that his warnings will not be heeded and they will continue willfully, he should not reprimand them. Better than that they transgress unknowingly than knowingly. So this is the principle of Mutav Sheyu Sheikigin V'al Yihiyu Mezidin, that if you know that they're not going to listen, then it's better not to reprimand them, because if they're not going to listen, right now they're doing an Aveira B'Sheigig, they're doing an Aveira unknowingly. If you tell them that they're not allowed to do it, but you know that they're not going to listen to you, so then not only have you not improved the situation, but you've made it worse, because now they're violating this mitzvah knowingly. However, this principle, which we call Mutav Sheyu Sheigin and Aliyah Mazidin, it doesn't apply in all situations. This principle applies to all prohibitions that are not explicitly stated in the Torah, but were derived by the sages through the principles of exegesis, or were received as a tradition passed down to them as laws taught by Moshe early on Har Sinai, so halacha l'Moshe Sinai, or were ordained by the sages themselves. If a person unwittingly violates a ruling of the sages because he did not know of the prohibition, and even if he were to be informed, he would not stand corrected, there is no obligation to remand him. On the contrary, it is preferable for him to transgress unknowingly than transgress knowingly. So let's say somebody doesn't know that you're not allowed to talk in the middle of Kaddish, and you know that it's unlikely that he's going to change his ways if you teach him better, then there's room to say, don't tell him. Okay. However, with regard to a prohibition, and this is where it comes relevant to our discussion here, with regard to a prohibition explicitly stated in the Torah, by contrast, one is obligated to reprimand the transgressor even if one knows that he will not accept the rebuke when he is informed of the prohibition. So the Alter Rebbe seems to be going with those opinions that even if you're not going to have any effect on him, he's going to continue driving on Shabbos, you still have to rebuke him. The rationale is that all of Israel are responsible for each other, and by reprimanding the transgressor, one frees himself of this liability, right? So that's like the idea I said before. I'm responsible for him, and therefore it's my responsibility to detest what he's doing and to demonstrate that I don't agree with this type of behavior, not because of something that I'm going to change about him, but because it's my duty to express my disdain for somebody rebelling the will of Hashem, the command of Hashem. Nevertheless, one should not reprimand him publicly more than once. One should not repeatedly reprimand the transgressor publicly once he is certain that the transgressor will not accept his rebuke. With regard to such matters, it was said that just as it is a mitzvah to say something that will be heeded, so is it a mitzvah not to say something that will not be heeded. So this statement of the Gemara, which we saw also last week, just as it's a mitzvah to say something that will be heeded, so is it a mitzvah not to say something that will not be heeded, is a Gemara in Yevamos. And there's the different poskim with different approaches to this whole topic that we're discussing today. So everyone places this somewhere else in the discussion. Under which circumstances do we say that it's a mitzvah not to say something that will not be heeded? So in this context, the Alter Rebbe says that what this is referring to is not to repeatedly reprimand somebody publicly if you know he's not going to accept his rebuke. But it doesn't exempt you from, according to this interpretation, it doesn't exempt you from reprimanding him the first time, because it's necessary to reprimand him the first time, in order to free yourself of the liability of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh. And it's also necessary for you continuously to do that. You have to continuously reprimand him, but not publicly. In private, by contrast, one is obligated to reprimand the transgressor even 100 times until the transgressor berates him. So that's like the third of the three opinions, until he reprimands you, until he berates you. Since he informed him of the transgression and he continued to willfully violate it, each and every member of the Jewish people is obligated to rebuke him. As it is written, you shall surely rebuke. The double verb, the dual verb implies that one must reiterate the rebuke even 100 times. Okay, there's more, but we'll stop here. Now I want to show you, we're going to read together elsewhere. This is in the laws of Yom Kippur. It's Alter Rebbe in chapter 608. And then we have the Alter Rebbe in chapter 156, where we'll see what seems to be quite a different take on this whole topic. Chapter 156 is the laws of desired patterns of business involvement and other ethical directives. Okay, so we go here to Sif Zayin, number 7. It says as follows: if one sees that his fellow man is sinning or is following in an undesirable path, it is a mitzvah to guide him back to the good and to inform him that he is wronging his soul through his evil deeds. As it is written, you shall surely admonish your fellow. Now here, there are already decisively two differences between this one, 156, and what we saw earlier, 168. Number one, here the Alter Rebbe adds a stipulation that it is his fellow man. In Hebrew, chaveroi, his friend. So, and we'll see soon the Alter Rebbe underscores that even more. So somehow here we're limiting it to somebody who's a friend of yours. And B, we're adding that the mitzvah is to guide him back to the good. To return him to a good path. Again, no mention of an obligation to rebuke him just for the sake of sort of clearing your own responsibility to detest something being done in violation of Hashem's command. Now, if the wrongdoer, somebody asking a question over there? If the wrongdoer does not take heed, one should admonish him again, as implied by the dual verb even 100 times, until the wrongdoer strikes him or curses him. So again, here we have another decisive difference between 156 and 608. In 608, he did pass like the third opinion in the Gemara, that you have to rebuke him until he reprimands you. And here the Alter Rebbe brings both of the other two opinions until he strikes you or he curses you. So another difference. And then one is obligated to admonish only a chaver, a comrade, shehu gasboy, a colleague with whom he is familiar. I think gasboy means more than familiar. Gasboy means that you're comfortable with him. You have a comfortable relationship with him. One is not required to admonish another person who will hate him and seek revenge. If he admonishes him, for such a person will certainly not listen to him. So whereas in 608 we were saying that even if he doesn't listen to you, you still have to continuously do it, though not in public. Here, basically it seems clear that if there's no chance that he's going to listen to you, then there's no further need to continuously reprimand. With regard to his friend, however, if it's somebody who you do have a close relationship, by contrast, even if one knows that he will not listen to him, one is obligated to admonish him, unless the sinner is transgressing unknowingly. In such an instance, we follow the principle of mutav sheyir shegigin v'aliyah mezidin, like we said before, that under certain circumstances, we say, if he's not going to listen to you anyway, and it's not something that's explicit in the Torah, then better that they do it unknowingly. And soon we're going to come back to review this paragraph, but let's continue the discussion here. So we have these different approaches, and what are we to make of all these contradictions between the very same author, the Alter Rebbe, in Shulchan Aruch, in two places, seemingly taking two very different approaches? And this is not just in the abstract, this is very practical. When I see somebody driving on Shabbos, if I see somebody coming to shul and he's putting on his talis around him, we're learning in Kitzur Shulchan Aruch the laws of wearing your talis. So I see somebody who comes to shul and wears his talis around his neck like a scarf instead of the way it has to be spread out over his whole body. So am I obligated to every single Shabbos go and tell him, my dear friend, have a good Shabbos, and very respectfully, I want you to know that the way you're doing the talis, wearing your talis, you don't fulfill your obligation. It's not kosher. It's bracha levatala. This is really bad, right? Do I have to do that or not? Now, we did put in the title about throwing rocks at cars on Shabbos. I think that we'll see soon more about that. But either way, I mean, we'll see soon more about perhaps we could differentiate a little bit between the responsibility of an individual and the responsibility of sort of the community. But one thing is clear of that certainly the first time you reprimand somebody, that it must be done in a way that's respectful and doesn't embarrass him and humiliate him. Now, if he doesn't listen to the first admonishment, then there may be room to embarrass him and humiliate him, as we discussed last week. That certainly if it's something if it's something between man and God, and he is not listening to the rebuke done in a respectful private way, then we go even in public and we humiliate him and rebuke him, etc. So if you see a Jew driving in West Rogers Park or on Shabbos, and you certainly can't throw rocks or humiliate him, you have to first have a nice conversation with him. The question then becomes, once you've had a nice conversation with him and you've told him that you're not allowed to drive on Shabbos and he continues listening, do you throw rocks next week, or how do we continue? And this is really seems to be obviously not just first of all, it's not an abstract question. This happens all the time, and also, there seems to be these contradictions. Now, as you can imagine, much has been written over the years in various halachic journals to try and determine these things, and specifically within the Chabad journals, there's a lot of emphasis in trying to figure out what do we do with these contradictions between the two places in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Now, part of the discussion is actually very fascinating and historical discussion, because we know that the Alter Rebbe, there's a number of things that the Alter Rebbe changed the way he ruled, the way he passed on later on in life. The Alter Rebbe originally started writing the Shulchan Aruch as an instruction of his Rebbe, the Maggid of Mezrich, and certain parts of the Shulchan Aruch were even, perhaps even the bulk of it, but certain parts of it certainly were completed in the lifetime of the Maggid. And the Maggid passed away in Tov Kuf Lamed Gimel at 1773 or 1772. I don't know the English date of Yitzhak Kislev in that year. Probably December of 1772. And so most of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch was written in the late 1760s and early 1770s. We know that later on in his life, the Alter Rebbe wrote other things. He wrote the Madura Basra, the later edition of certain parts of Shulchan Aruch that came to us. He wrote the Siddur, and there's numerous things that the Alter Rebbe changed his mind about later on in his life, which basically was three things. First of all, the way the Alter Rebbe's children write about it is that Hosef Chachma Chachmasei became much wiser, and one of the things that he changed was that whereas early on in his life he relied very heavily on the opinion of the Magen Avraham, later on in his life he was more at liberty to rely on other opinions differing than the Magen Avraham. Another difference is that later on in his life, he relied more on Kabbalistic sources, even in Paskening Halacha, than he did early on in his life. And of course, thirdly, there were manuscripts and Sfarim, which he got hold of later on in life, famously Tshuvas Harashba and other things which he did not have earlier on, and that also affected his opinion. Now, so we know that the bulk of Shulchan Aruch the Alter Rebbe wrote in, again, as we said, in the late 1760s and early 1770s, and that includes Siman Tov Reish Ches, the laws of Yom Kippur. Now, the simanim that we're the other siman that I showed you, which was siman chapter 155 and 156. So those two simanim, 155 and 156. First of all, just open up in Shulchan Aruch in Hebrew and English, you'll see right away that the style of those two chapters in the Alter Rebbe is very different than the rest of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. There's a lot of notes and parentheses. It's written in a very different style, and so the historians, Rabbi Shlomo Munshein and many others, have demonstrated quite convincingly that those two chapters, 155 and 156, were written much later in the Alter Rebbe's life. And I'll just go through some of the primary proofs to that. Number one, in chapter 155, the Alter Rebbe quotes Hilchos Talmud Torah. The Alter Rebbe, in addition to the Shulchan Aruch, he wrote a separate 4-chapter booklet called Hilchos Talmud Torah, which the Rebbe actually encouraged to learn. The Rebbe reprinted it, I think, a couple of times. So that Hilchos Talmud Torah was published in 1794. So that's 30 years later than he wrote the rest of Shulchan Aruch. That's when it was published, and it seems, again, as the scholars say, that the Alter Rebbe wrote it close to the time that it was published. So in chapter 155 of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, he quotes Hilchos Talmud Torah. So it would appear that those two simanim of Shulchan Aruch were authored approximately 30 years later than the rest of the Shulchan Aruch. He also quotes, the only time in the entire Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch where he quotes the Pri Megadim is in chapter 155, and the Pri Megadim was printed for the first time in 1785. So again, at least 15 years later or so, then he wrote the bulk of the Shulchan Aruch. Now, another interesting note that the Rebbe makes is that it appears that there is the final section of Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch is called Choshen Mishpat, where it's halachas etzrichas. It's not the full-blown Choshen Mishpat with all the monetary laws of witnesses and dayanim, etc., but it's sort of day-to-day laws, monetary and interpersonal things that are important to know. And it appears that 155 and 156 were written at least similar in time to that because they are cross-referenced. And in Choshen Mishpat, where the Alter Rebbe talks about the laws of letting go of a debt because of Shemitah, he says that Shemitah was, he gives an example of 1784. So the Rebbe points out that we can deduce from there that Choshen Mishpat was written in the late 1780s. So again, this is all putting the time of authoring 155 and 156 in the late 1780s and early 1790s. Now, it's also interesting to note that the Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, was first printed in 1814, and then many prints followed in different print houses with different editions and edits, etc. Chapters 155 and 156 first appeared in the 1856 printing of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. That's 50 years after its first printing, with a note that we found these additional 2 chapters in manuscript. So again, further pointing to the fact that those chapters were written much later. Now, if all of what we just said is accurate, then we could say that, look, the Alter Rebbe has changed his mind. Whereas in chapter 208, he held that you're obligated to reprimand somebody not time and again until he reprimands you, but time and again, even if you're not going to have any effect on him. Later on, he changed his mind and he said that no, we're only obligated to do this mitzvah if you actually have a serious chance to influence him. And this would address certainly many of the changes. So, for example, the fact that in chapter 156, the Alter Rebbe emphasizes that it has to be your friend, somebody who you're comfortable with, or acquaintance with, have a good friendship with, etc. That's the type of person who you're going to have to reprimand. Also, he changes from reprimanding to cursing or hitting. Now think about it. If you're just walking up to a stranger and he reprimands you, then okay, you've already done it. Again, there we're not talking about influencing him to change. We're talking about making your point that you're demonstrating against the violation of the will of Hashem. He's reprimanded you. That's it. You've demonstrated it enough. But whereas in chapter 156, he's talking about talking to a friend of yours, to somebody who you're good with, and and you're trying to influence him to stop biting his nail, to stop doing something wrong. So there, just the fact that he reprimands you, I mean, between good friends, you could say something sharp to somebody else, to the other friend, and that doesn't mean your friendship is over, right? You may still have a chance to influence him. But once he's cursing you or about to strike you, now that's when the friendship itself is on the line, and you're no longer his friend, and you no longer really have an opportunity to change him. This, and also, like I said before, the changes between 208 and 156 also match up very neatly with moving away from the psakim of the Magen Avraham, with relying more on the Kabbalists. For example, in the Zohar and in the Shalah and other Mukabbalim, we find that they paskin like the opinion that you have to rebuke him until he's about to hit you. So the changes make a lot of sense. Another very important thing is Perek Lamed Beis in Tanya. We're going to see in a minute that in Perek Lamed Beis in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe also severely limits the scope of the obligation to rebuke. Now, Perek Lamed Beis in Tanya, even though Tanya was written much earlier, Tanya was written much earlier, Madura Bat Kama certainly, but Perek Lamed Beis, the 32, the lave or the heart of the Tanya, which is all about Avos Yisrael, really in the map of Tanya, it comes in parenthetic. It's by the way, it's talking about learning how to treat your body as secondary to your neshama. And the Alter Rebbe Perek Lamed Beis says that, by the way, a side benefit of that is also that it enhances Avos Yisrael. Now, Perek Lamed Beis was not there. If you look in the Madura Kama of Tanya, in the first edition of Tanya, which again the Rebbe printed, Perek Lamed Beis doesn't exist. There's only 52 chapters of Tanya, and Perek Lamed Gimel was written Perek Lamed Beis was written and inserted into Tanya much later. And again, according to the historians and scholars of early Chabad history, it seems like Perek Lamed Beis was written around 1796. Again, right around the time, a few years after we're putting the authoring of chapters 155 and 156. So if we are to find that Perek Lamed Beis of Tanya fits with what we're saying now about chapter 156, then that is awesome. And indeed it does. So let's look at Perek Lamed Beis of Tanya. In Tanya, Perek Lamed Beis, the Alter Rebbe is talking about how it's a mitzvah to love Avos Yisrael, and he's extending the limits of this very strongly, that really everyone, and very all-encompassing mitzvah. And then the Alter Rebbe says, well, hold on a second. The Gemara says that if you see your friend doing an Aveira, then it's a mitzvah to hate him, and also to tell your teacher to hate him. So how can I, the Alter Rebbe, suggest that it's a mitzvah to love every single Jew under all circumstances? It appears clearly from this Gemara that it's not, that there are certain situations where it's a mitzvah to hate somebody. If somebody's doing an Aveira, you must hate them, right? So the Alter Rebbe says a number of conditions. In order for it to be a mitzvah to hate a Jew, there has to be a number of conditions met. Number one, it has to be somebody who is who is your colleague in Torah and mitzvah. So I'm going to read to you the notes as they are from Lessons in Tanya, and this part of the Lessons in Tanya was taken from the Rebbe's edits. Rabbi Weinberg used to submit to the Rebbe the notes for his radio show of the Lessons in Tanya in Yiddish, and the Rebbe would edit it. And here's how the Rebbe interpreted this part of chapter 32 of Tanya. The sinner in question is a Torah observant scholar, but has lapsed in this one instance. In this case, his sin is much more severe than usual, since it is written that even the shkagos, even the inadvertent misdeeds of a scholar are as grave as deliberate sins, right? So only chaver b'terem mitzvahs, only somebody who's a scholar, who's a knowledgeable person, only then is it a mitzvah to hate him. However, the Alter Rebbe then adds that even in such a situation, it's still not good enough to hate him, because maybe he's inadvertent. Now, even though it's true that an inadvertent sin of a Talmid Chacham, somebody who should know better, assumes the severity of a deliberate sin, as the Alter Rebbe explained in the previous chapter, in chapter 31. Nevertheless, even this general assumption of the gravity of his conduct is not sufficient cause to hate him. The Alter Rebbe continues, yet another condition must first be satisfied. You have to know that this specific sin that this person is doing is not just considered as grave as deliberate sin because he should know better, but it's actually a deliberate sin. How do you go to know if it's actually a deliberate sin? Because you've already fulfilled the mitzvah of you've already fulfilled the mitzvah to rebuke him. Mitzvahs, which means to rebuke somebody who's with you, who's your colleague in Torah mitzvahs. Nevertheless, he has not repented from it, he's not returned from his sin, as it says in Sefer Haredim. Now here, remember before we had this Gemara in Yevamos, which says that it's a mitzvah not to say something which is not going to be heard. Here the Tzemach Tzedek in his notes in Tanya refers us to the Maharsha, and that Gemara where the Maharsha suggests that because we have the word rebuke your friend, right? So that the mitzvah of rebuking only applies to somebody who is your friend. And within the word friend, there could be two interpretations. It could mean somebody who is your friend, as in Chaver B'Torah Mitzvahs, he's also a frum observant Jew as you are, or it could be somebody who you have a good relationship with. Now, there's some discussion about this in the Chassidus Mevaris on Tanya in the back. He goes into some depth. He analyzes this greatly, but I think that. The point being that you only have to rebuke somebody who there's a chance that you're going to be able to influence them. So there's two types of friendships that could lend themselves to that scenario. Number one, if he's a good friend of yours. So even if you're from and you're living an observant lifestyle, but he's not, but if you have a very good friendship with him, then you can influence him to also start accepting the observance of Torah mitzvahs. And similarly, if you don't know him at all, but you're both from Jews, so then there's a certain camaraderie that's almost taken for granted. So just for example, you would never walk over to some stranger in the street and tell him, that his collar is bent up, not because there's anything rude about that, because he's a stranger, you don't know him, and it's not your business whether or not his collar is bent out of shape. But you may very well be davening, be on vacation, be traveling somewhere, be in a shul where nobody knows you and you don't know anyone. And somebody might come over to you and say, your tefillin are not straight. And not only would you not be offended, you would be appreciative that the person helped you fulfill the mitzvah of tefillin properly. So, Chaver B'Torah Mitzvahs, if somebody is a frum Jew, even if you don't know him, then there's still a chance that you may be able to influence him to better his ways. And there's a certain camaraderie just in the fact that you're both devoting your lives to serving Hashem and to following Torah mitzvahs, that would also lend itself to the mitzvah. Somebody, and here the Alter Rebbe sort of says two things, which would appear to fit nicely with the interpretation I just said, that somebody who is A, not your friend, and B, not close to you. So there could be two things. You could be your friend as in Chaver B'Torah Mitzvahs, that you're both, quote, belong to the same party. Yeah, you're both observant Jews. Or Mikorvasa, you could have a friendship with him. So then, not only is there no mitzvah to hate him, but there's no mitzvah. But on the contrary, you have to be mekar of him. You have to really try to influence, to draw him near, and to be nice to him and love him. And either possibly your love will indeed cause him to become closer to Torah mitzvahs, and even if not, doesn't matter. Lehivsid mitzvahs avasreim. So I'm about to upset the apple cart, spoiler alert, but it appears from Kuf Nun Hey, from Kuf Nun Vav, sorry, from the Alter Rebbe's later opinion, both in Shulchan Aruch and from his interpretation in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe is severely limiting the scope of the mitzvah to rebuke somebody only to somebody who you have some sort of affinity with, and somebody who there's a realistic prognosis that you may be able indeed to influence him. However, in the Tzemach Tzedek's notes on Tanya, the Tzemach Tzedek doesn't seem to be very happy with this. It doesn't seem to. He quotes a number of sources, for halachic sources, that seem to suggest that it's very difficult to limit the scope of Hechech Dechiach so much. And indeed, in numerous sichos and letters from the Rebbe, we find also that he is very he seems to be questioning this this maskama, so to speak, this takeaway. The Rebbe doesn't talk about it in the context of Siman Kuf Nun Vav of 156 in Shulchan Aruch. The Rebbe is talking about it in the context of Perek Lamed Beis in Tanya and invoking the note of the Tzemach Tzedek, and sort of the Rebbe really doesn't seem very comfortable with this takeaway. Now, it doesn't affect the message of Perek Lamed Beis in Tanya is not affected by this, because the message of Perek Lamed Beis in Tanya is, of that part of Perek Lamed Beis, the way the Rebbe explains it is that in the mitzvah to hate somebody who's doing something wrong is only when he's somebody who is in general a frum person, so he does the right things. But there's one case where he's deliberately doing something wrong, and you know it's deliberate because you've rebuked him, and it's kind of it's a very rare scenario that somebody should be committed to a Torah life, but insist repeatedly on doing something wrong, even though he knows it's wrong. That's the only case where there's any mitzvah l'snoisa, and even then, Alter Rebbe says it's a mitzvah to hate him, and there's also a mitzvah to love him, as elaborated on Perek Lamed Beis. So the Rebbe's and the Tzemach Tzedek's and the Rebbe's tzarich discomfort with this, with that detail of Perek Lamed Beis doesn't affect the overall message of Perek Lamed Beis. But both the Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek don't seem to really go with this, that there's no mitzvah to rebuke somebody if he's not your friend, then it doesn't seem likely that you will have any effect on him. So let me go through some of the sources, and then I'll share with you what I know about this. Or what I think about this. So number one, again, just some random examples. There's obviously many more. There is in the back of Chelik Chof Aleph of Likutei Sichos, there is a long, quite a number of pages, a discussion about the Rebbe explaining why he's getting involved in the whole question of Mir Yehudi, of who is a Jew. And one of the things the Rebbe says over there is that even if you know, he quotes the Gemara in the Gemara in Shabbos, which seems to be saying that you can never really know that what you're saying will have no effect. But even if what you're saying will have no effect, the Rebbe says the Rebbe is saying it's my responsibility, and this is a long discussion of a number of pages, but the Rebbe is basically saying that it's my responsibility to voice very loudly my opposition to what's going on in Eretz Yisrael with the law of return, with who is a Jew controversy. Okay, in the back of Chelik Vav of Likutei Sichos, there is a long, a few pages also response to the challenges of Mitzvah Tefillin. So in 1967, and a few weeks before the 6th Day War, the Rebbe initiated the Tefillin campaign, and there was much opposition voiced from various factions of the Orthodox community. And in the back of Chelik Vav of Likutei Sichos, there is a few pages as a response. The Rebbe goes, question number one, why do you choose Tefillin? Answer. Question number two, why? What's question number two? And what's the point? What's the big deal if you get somebody to put on tefillin only one time, etc., etc. There's a total of I think 4 or 5 questions, is it? And then 4 questions, and then the Rebbe says, add kind of questions to answers that were received, and now I just want to make the general point that that the mitzvah is to rebuke, and here the Rebbe says that the mitzvah is to rebuke even if you know that it won't have any effect, and it quotes Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch in Siman Tafresh Ches that we saw the laws in Yom Kippur chapter 608. And then the Rebbe says that anyway it's irrelevant because now once we've had so much weeks of experience with mitzvahs film, we see that that's not the case anyway. And then the Rebbe quotes this the Hagos of the Samach Tzedek and Tanya and Tzarachi and Gadol, that it appears to be very difficult to justify what the Alter Rebbe is saying over here, that there's no mitzvah to rebuke. It's difficult to square that with all the sources we have in the Gemara and the Paskim, etc. And the Rebbe seems to be leaning towards that there is a mitzvah to rebuke even if you're not going to have an effect. What's very interesting over here is that here the Rebbe is not talking about what we call rebuking. He's not talking about making demonstrations. Again, in Siman Tafresh Ches, the simple reading is that even if you know you're not going to have an effect, it's your obligation to protest that, to demonstrate that you detest this violation of the command of Hashem. Here the Rebbe sort of, if you will, translating that into modern terms and saying, go over to the guy and offer him to put on tefillin and tell him about this opportunity and the importance of this mitzvah. So the Rebbe is sort of putting it in the cloak of the mitzvah to rebuke, not in the cloak. Yeah, the Rebbe is saying that how do you fulfill this mitzvah to rebuke? On the one hand, you have to do it even if you know he's not going to listen to you, not like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya. But at the same time, the Rebbe is not recommending going out there and making demonstrations. The Rebbe is recommending to do it in the way of offering somebody to put on tefillin, which I find very interesting. Now, this very same note of the Rebbe, which, as I said, was printed in Likutei Sichos in the back of Chelik Vav, was copied and pasted again in another Sicha later on in Chelik Yud Aleph, and there's one line added to this footnote, the way it's printed in Chelik Lamed Aleph, in Parshas Pekudei, which is, see, Shalos Shuvas Minchas Yitzchak, Chelik Dalet, Siman Ayin Tes, and Siman Pei. So let's look at what in other words, the Rebbe seem to be saying that these Shuvas from the Minchas Yitzchak are very relevant to the Rebbe's point. Now, if you look at those Shuvas, the Minchas Yitzchak was Rabbi Yitzchak Weiss, who later on became the Rav in Yerushalayim, but these Shuvas were written in Tafshin Chav Gimel in 1963 when he was the Rav in Manchester. And it's interesting that the bulk of these Shuvas are actually, of these two Shuvas, that the Rebbe quotes, are in response or analyzing very respectfully the Teshuvah written by the Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoel Satmar. And the question then was that there was a certain individual who was an expert in building mikvahs, and he was called to a certain town, to a big city. He doesn't say what the name of the city. He was called to a big city to build a mikvah. Now, this was a city which never had a mikvah, and there was no established Orthodox community over there. But for some reason, it doesn't say why, they wanted to build a kosher mikvah there. And this would save people from the Torah for the entire Samishmach. It would be a tremendous thing. However, the question that he asked the Satmar Rebbe, and that the Rebbe is now quoting from Minchas Yitzchak and Likutei Sichos, is it appropriate for me to help these people who are completely not observant to build a mikvah? This will maybe give them some sort of hechsher, and may even cause other people who wouldn't otherwise consider tempted to be moving to that town. Here you have a town which everybody could, nobody's going to, if you don't dress sneers and if you don't keep the rules and you don't go to minyan, nobody's going to look your way. I could never move there because there was no mikvah. Now there's a mikvah, and I could move there. So this would be tempting to get more from people to move there, and that would be, quote, bad for the Jews. So he asked the Satmar Rebbe what to do, and the Satmar Rebbe told him that he must build a mikvah there. But it seemed like the Satmar Rebbe was insisting that Rabbi Weiss, the Minchas Yitzchak, would review the teshuvah of the Satmar Rebbe and show his own opinion. And this is a lengthy teshuvah of the Minchas Yitzchak, where he confirms the opinion of the Satmar Rebbe that the mikveh must be built. And again, there's a lot of discussion here of that you must rebuke. And one of the things that's interesting is that he quotes this Gemara. He brings many sources here from earlier, and there's one source that he brings from Reb Hirsch, Reb Hillel, I don't know who this is, the Maskil al-Dal, and he says, Gedoyel HaMechichim, he was a Hungarian, one of the great rebukers. And over there he's talking about the obligation to rebuke and to help people, even if they're not observant, that you must, if you're able to help them be observant of a mitzvah, then it's very important to do so. And he brings the Minchas Yitzchak brings a number of sources that this Gemara that we said earlier from the Reb Tarfon and I think it was Rabbi Ben Azariah, that nowadays, already in the times of the Mishnah, there's nobody who really knows how to rebuke properly and nobody who knows how to rebuke properly. God forbid, chas v'shalom, to take that literally at face value, that nowadays nobody needs to rebuke. How could you even consider the notion that there's a mitzvah in the Torah of that no longer applies? Rather, basically, that mitzvah, that Gemara is supposed to be taken as encouragement, that because there's always the setback, that if you tell somebody to improve his ways, he'll tell you, why are you telling me to remove the splinter from between my eyes, remove the beam from between your eyes? So those Gemaras are to be taken as encouragement to make sure that you are okay, to polish up your own ways so that your rebuke will be more effective, but not to be taken in any way as an excuse to throw the mitzvah of Hechech Techiach out the window. And interestingly, he quotes in Abu Dirham, that Abu Dirham asks the question, why do we not make a bracha? Before you're about to tell somebody that he's not doing a mitzvah properly, you should say, Baruch atah Hashem, asher kiddushanu mitzvah v'tzivonu, right? Why don't we make a bracha? So the Abarbanel quotes this Gemara that Tamei if there's anybody who knows how to rebuke properly, and he says that's why you don't make a bracha, because maybe your rebuke won't be effective. So the Minchas Yitzchak says, you see from the Abu Dirham that he doesn't say that Gemara gives you an excuse not to do the Heichacha. You have to do Heichacha, but that Gemara is the reason why you don't make a bracha, because there's actually legitimate concern that maybe your rebuke will not be effective. So this is the Minchas Yitzchak that the Rebbe quotes as part of underscoring the Rebbe's Tzarech Iyun together with the Tzemach Tzedek on this idea that the Rebbe says in Perek Lamed Beis of Tanya, which severely limits the scope of the mitzvah, and the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe are further expanding the scope of the mitzvah of Hechech Techiach. However, we should never forget, and we touched on this last week, that the Hechech, any type of rebuke, has to come with absolute Avos Yisrael. I'll just give you a number of references where the Rebbe discusses it. Number one is in Chelik Yud in the Sikha of Parshas Noach, famous Sikha, where the Rebbe talks about the Gemara that the Torah goes out of its way to say, not to speak badly. It says Asher Einanu Tohera, the animal which is not pure. It doesn't say the impure animal, even though in English that's the same thing. Yeah? English doesn't have a word for not pure. We just say impure. But in Hebrew we don't say Tameh, we say Einanu Tohera. And the Rebbe talks there about. So the Rebbe quotes over there from the Meir Naim, I think, that from the Shem Baal Shem Tov, that if you see somebody else doing something bad, it's a siman that there's something bad in you, and it's like you're looking into a mirror, and if you see dirt on the face of the reflection in the mirror, then chances are there's dirt on your face. So, unless it's a movie. So the Rebbe asked the question over there, what do you mean? Maybe you're seeing something because you have to fulfill the mitzvah of rebuking your fellow. And the point that the Rebbe makes over there, and I strongly encourage people to look up the Sikha, it's a beautiful Sikha, is that when you see somebody doing something wrong, what do you see? Do you see something wrong, or is all that you see the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of Hechech Techiach? If you see, in fact, we gave the mashal last week, when somebody has dust on their jacket, do you see that this guy is a shlump, or do you see that you have to dust off your jacket? So if you see somebody doing something wrong and you see that as a chesaron, as something wrong with that person, That's what the Me'onaim is talking about. That's when the dirt on the mirror is probably the dirt on your own face. But if you see something doing something wrong, you don't see it as something wrong, but you see it just as an opportunity to fulfill mitzvahs and to help other people fulfill more mitzvahs, then that is the appropriate way. Another important, interesting thing where the Rebbe talks about this is in Parshas Shmos Tafshin Nun Aleph, where there was a certain individual in Eretz Yisrael who was reprimanding the Jewish people and telling them that another Holocaust is coming, and this was on the eve of the Gulf War, etc. And the Rebbe spoke out very sharply against him, and then the comeback was, well, what do you mean? The Jewish prophets always spoke harshly to the Jewish people, and the Bali Musar, etc. And the Rebbe makes a number of points. Again, we're running out of time, so I don't want to go into all the details, and I highly recommend you look it up. It's Parshas Shmos Tafshin Nun Aleph. But again, the Rebbe makes the point that first of all, you're not a prophet. If God tells you to say something, then you have to say it. But if God didn't tell you to say anything, you don't have to say it. And even within prophets, we see that there were certain prophets who avoided saying such things. Again, a long discussion in the footnotes of that sikha. And concerning the Bali Musa, the Rebbe insisted that any harsh words that were said to the Jewish people by qualified Bali Musa were said out of the deepest love for the Jewish people, and they included themselves. It wasn't talking down at them, but they included themselves in the community of people that has to better their ways. And one of the places the Rebbe also quotes refers to Oir HaTorah of the Maggid. And a very interesting word from Oir HaTorah from the Maggid of Mezrich on this, that he brings a pasuk with the Maimon Chazal that says, Oizvei Torah Yahalalu Rasha, those who abandon the Torah praise the Rasha, V'shomrei Torah, and those who guard the Torah, Yisgaru Bam, Yisgaru translates as Reitzon. How do you say in English? The guarders of the Torah, they upset, or whatever the word is.
What's the Hebrew word?
Yisgaru. Sorry, the English word is slipping my mind right now. Yisgaru Bam. But the guarders of the Torah, they fight with them. So again, a long piece of it, but basically what the Maggid says is that there's two approaches within those who serve Hashem. There are those who praise the Rasha, figuratively, which means that they don't rebuke the Rashayim. Rather, they try to be nice to them, and they find merit and try to find merit and excuses for the people who are not keeping the Torah. And then there's the Shomrei Torah, those who say, no, what do you mean? How could you stand by idly and quiet when somebody is violating the Torah? And the Maggid basically says how there's value to both of these approaches, and that's why the conflict over here is between these two schools within people who are good Jews. There's these two schools of thought, and both of them have value. So certainly there's a tremendous challenge in fulfilling this mitzvah. On the one hand, we're saying that it's very all-encompassing, and on the other hand, we're also saying that it must be done with the utmost avos Yisrael and respect and love, and no personal vendetta, and has to be void of any personal feelings or negative feelings or thoughts about the other person. So it certainly becomes a challenge. And whilst I certainly don't have a sort of clear-cut answer for every situation, but it's certainly something which we constantly have to be aware of, the challenge between, on the one hand, it's our responsibility to do as much as we can in this direction. On the other hand, we also have to make sure that we are fit. Before we sign off over here, one more very important point. And that is that the Rebbe's, in a number of places that the Rebbe talks about, So before we say this other point, I alluded to this before, I want to go back to reading this last piece of the Shulchan Aruch over here. To whom does the above apply? Again, this is from chapter 56. To a private individual who is admonishing others. The rabbinical court, by contrast, is obligated to admonish and rebuke transgressors so that they themselves will not be held accountable for that sin. This applies even if the prohibition is a matter of doubt, and even if there are many who transgress knowingly. The court should not evade responsibility by saying better they transgress unknowingly or knowingly. The exception. Okay, yeah, right. So basically, the limit here earlier in 156, the Alter Rebbe limited the scope of the mitzvah, but then the Alter Rebbe says that the Beis Din, they have a more broader responsibility, and I want to suggest that perhaps, we talk about a Beis Din, and nowadays we don't have a Beis Din in those ways that the Beis Din have authority and monetary, and the Beis Din could issue decrees and fines, and we don't have that nowadays. But in the Tshuva of the Minchas Yitzchak that I mentioned before, that the Rebbe references, there's a long piece over there where he talks about Shluchus de Kamoy Avdinon, that even though there's no Beis Din, we are there to fulfill, we are somehow agents of the theoretical Beis Din, or agents of the Beis Din of days of yore. And so maybe change the word Beis Din for community or leaders. And perhaps this is what the Rebbe is saying over here when he's talking about Miftzat Tefillin and referencing this Tshuva of Minchas Yitzchak, and in other letters, there's one specific letter printed in the back of the Likkutei Zayin, where the Rebbe is writing to a certain Rav, again, a leader of a community, who wanted to make Aliyah to fulfill the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, and the Rebbe told him that your responsibility to your community is overriding, even if you think your community won't listen to your rebuke, you have the responsibility to stay there and continue rebuking them, or to continue teaching them and guiding them. And perhaps the same can be said about the Rebbe's call. For example, the example we gave was Miftzat Tefillin, that the Rebbe, as a leader of the Jewish community, and each and every one of us, as the Rebbe coined it, shluchim, that we all, the Rebbe sort of charged us with his mission, so to speak, that even though you may make the case that on my personal responsibility by the letter of the law, it's not my responsibility to go out there and seek to influence others in the direction of Torah mitzvahs. And I may, again, strictly by the letter of the law, just keep to my own business. And there may indeed be halachic justification for that. But the Rebbe is pushing the envelope in the other direction and empowering, like Jonathan Sachs famously said, the Rebbe didn't want followers, he wanted leaders. The Rebbe is empowering each and every one of us to assume the position of, quote unquote, the Beis Din, whose obligation it is to stand in the forefront to promote the agendas of Hashem and of Torah and mitzvahs. Okay, I think that brings to a close my thoughts about this topic. So again, I don't necessarily have the exact recipe and answer for every time you see somebody wearing the talis over his neck instead of spread out properly, when the correct time and how the correct process is to do it. And like we saw before from the Maggid, there are two legitimate schools of thought and two legitimate approaches. But overall, certainly for us, the Rebbe strongly encourages going in the direction of being as involved as possible in influencing other people to do mitzvahs properly, and at the same time doing things b'ofen hamiskabel in a way which is coming from absolute Avos Yisrael. And like we saw the Hayom Yom last week, that if the rebuke is not successful, then you must attribute the failure to yourself, that you were not as loving and as caring and as impartial as you ought to have been. Okay, so you're asking a very important question. And the question is basically, when we're trying to influence people to experience Judaism, and it may involve inviting them over for Shabbos, even though they're going to drive, and how do we approach, what do we do about that? So it's a very complex question, a very complex topic. We've actually discussed this in the past. A few years ago, we did a few classes on that topic. But again, it's a balance. In fact, there's one place in the Likkutei where it's published where the Rebbe admonished the shliach for having people drive over to him on Simchas Torah, and the Rebbe said, next time put an ad in the paper that if you're going to drive, better not to come. Right? So that's one aspect. On the other hand, similar perhaps to, in a similar spirit to what we said before about if you know he's not going to listen, better don't tell him, because then you're just going to make it worse. Now he's going to be doing the same avera b'mezid deliberately instead of inadvertently. So Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach makes the case that the mitzvah, and this goes over a little bit from the, I mean, they overlap. The mitzvah of to rebuke and the mitzvah of lifnei iver, to put a stumbling block before the blind. And Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says that you have to have the overall picture in mind. So, for example, he says, if you have, he's talking in Israel, where often you may have construction or other laborers in your house who are Jewish. He says, are you allowed to give them a drink of water or offer them something to eat? They're going to eat it without a bracha. You're not allowed to give somebody something to eat if he's going to eat it without a bracha. And Rosh Hashanah makes the argument that actually you're going to do much more to the furtherance of their observance of Yiddishkeit by offering them water and showing them that you're a mensch, than by not offering them water because you're going to insist that they make a bracha. And so that would be an argument in favor of inviting somebody for Shabbos, because even though he's going to drive this time, but the hope is that he's going to continue coming and eventually he's going to learn to appreciate Shabbos, and that's the other way forward. Now, that's a very dangerous waters to step on, because usually we don't make these calculations. We have to do what God said, even, in times when, well, I think it would be better for Judaism if I give women aliyah, so count women to me, and obviously we don't do that. So it certainly is delicate waters to tread, and individual cases should be discussed with a local competent Orthodox knowledgeable rabbi. What you certainly, like you alluded to in the question, was you offer them a place to stay. That's certainly helpful. Another thing that you could do, it becomes more challenging in the winter, but you can invite them to come before Shabbos. So certainly in the summer, even in the winter, sometimes it can be done. Now everybody's working from home anyway, so you could just ditch work anyway. So you tell them, Shabbos comes in at sunset is at 4:20. Tell them we're going to start at 4:00, and so like this, at least the way that they come before Shabbos, and then your Shabbos meal is going to be so inspiring. You'll knock them out, and they'll just fall asleep on the couch, and will stay with you till the end of Shabbos. Please God.